ATS tries to avoid jargon as much as possible, but one phrase that's important to know for us is that when we at ATS are talking about assessment, we're really talking about student learning or educational assessment. When we use the word evaluation, for the most part, we're talking about institutional evaluation more broadly. So institutional evaluation would include things like personnel evaluation, program evaluation, kind of overall strategic planning and evaluation. Assessment, both as I'm talking about it today in this session and as the accrediting standards talk about more generally, typically refers to educational assessment and the assessment of student learning. I'm going to talk in this session just a little bit about other student outcomes too, which blur the line a little bit between assessment and evaluation in our kind of framework. But that's a helpful reminder, and maybe is good for those of you who may have entered into this thinking I might talk about things more broadly. At the same time, a lot of what we talk about in terms of educational assessment can also be applied to institutional evaluation. So you might find the same sorts of questions or the same sorts of strategies maybe flowing over from one into the other. We have a variety of resources for this at the ATS Commission. A few of them I've got here on the screen. One is the Commission standards themselves. I'm narrating this in the summer of 2018, and with our current accrediting standards as I'm talking about it now, the educational standard includes a fairly significant section on educational assessment. It's in ES section 6. We're beginning the process of redeveloping the accrediting standards, so these might move around, but I imagine no matter what the new standards look like, assessment will play a central role. You'll also see in the self-study handbook, right now it's in chapter 7 of the self-study handbook, a document called a reflective guide to effective assessment of student learning. And that's a document that really kind of narrates how you might apply the Commission standards in your own context. It's meant to be friendly and practical and really focus in on the same sorts of things that I'm talking about today. And then finally, we've got a section of our website that's designated for assessment coordinators. I'm in the process right now of revising that, so the content will look a little different than it does on the screen here. And in fact, the new page will include quite a few resources that you might find helpful. So if you are interested in doing some more reading, or if you're looking for other kinds of resources, you'll find those on our assessment coordinators webpage, which is under the resources section of our website. So I mentioned at the beginning the 3 S's that are the title of this session. And this is the actual quote from the accrediting standards that really right in the midst of the accrediting standards is the emphasis that assessment should be simple and sustainable while also adequate. I use the word sufficient because we like the alliteration here, but you've got that right there built into the accrediting standards. And if you're not super familiar with the ATS accrediting standards, we always like to remind folks that these standards come from the membership on behalf of the membership. So these aren't written by bureaucrats in some office far, far away. These have come from member schools. That we talk about them in the preface to the standards as being the accrued wisdom of the member schools. And right in the midst of that wisdom was this language about simple, sustainable, and sufficient. So kind of quickly, I'm going to run through a little bit of what we mean by these. So simple. When I'm at a school or when I'm reviewing their assessment plan, one of the first things with simple that I have to mention is just like with student work or a sermon or something else, longer is not always better. And in fact, sometimes the longer plans become much more cumbersome and end up being not as effective as a shorter one might be. I also want to remind schools that simplicity can be a kind of a benefit or a beauty to be aimed for. So to think about data that you already have, to ask whether you're missing data or you're just missing documentation, and to stay focused on your goal. So in all of these sorts of ways, as you're developing an assessment plan or as you're evaluating your current assessment plan, just keep in mind that simple can be a benefit. So not reinventing the wheel, not doing work that doesn't need to be done just for the sake of doing it, but really thinking through what's kind of the minimum or the baseline that we need in order to do the work that we're trying to do. Similarly with sustainable, I'll often use the example of the dentist or the doctor in this case. When I go to the doctor, it doesn't do me any good if I start exercising just the week before I go to the doctor. It also doesn't do any good if I come out of my doctor's visit with kind of an idea that's unachievable in terms of the things that I'll take on for healthy practices those next year or two, right? So as we're thinking about educational assessment plans, is your plan sustainable and are your practices sustained? So is it something that you can manage and will you actually manage? Assessment works best not when it's done just for the sake of an accrediting review, but it should be regular and ongoing. It should look at where you've been and where you're headed towards, and it should make sense in your context. Probably one of the most frustrating things that happens around assessment plans with our office is schools contact us and ask for sample assessment plans. And I give them the awful answer of saying, no, I don't have samples that I can share with you. And they're frustrated, and I wish I could help in those sorts of ways. But what we've discovered is that because our institutions are so different in terms of their sizes, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of even the educational plan, that an assessment plan that works well at one school might be way too much or way too little or focused in quite the wrong way for another school. So I'm sorry that I give you that frustrating answer, but this is part of the sense of both simple and sustainable, is that it needs to fit your own mission, your own context, and your own understanding of what your educational work is about. But then also sufficient. So as you can imagine, it's not enough to have a plan that's simple and sustainable. It also has to do what you want it to do. So it needs to be able to evaluate or assess or give you information that's useful on student learning. Sometimes we see schools that evaluate the things that are easy to evaluate rather than the things that they really want to know or need to know or focus in on at their context. And so that's one of the ways in which I'll talk to a school about a plan maybe not being sufficient. If it's not appropriate to their mission, if it's not useful to them, if it's not interesting to them, it's not a sufficient plan. Similarly, when I talk with faculty in particular about assessment plans, I want to know whether they feel like they're learning from their assessment plan, and in particular, can they be surprised by what they find? Now, there's a way in which it makes sense for assessment to be able to be kind of a defensive tool to show that you actually are doing the things that you've been asked to do. But as long as you have to do assessment, I wish that schools could also do it in ways that help them, whether that's them as a faculty or as an institution more broadly, to think about what it is they'd like to know about their students or their alumni, and to have these assessment tools help answer some of those questions. And then finally, this is probably the thing that we have repeated the most over the past year, so I probably don't even need to say it anymore. But we talk about the importance of closing the loop with assessment. It's not enough in an assessment plan to just collect data or even just to have faculty conversation or teaching level conversation about whether and how students are learning. But you need to implement the changes that are needed when there are needed changes. And then you need to evaluate whether those changes had the impact that you wish they did. So I'll see schools sometimes that will have good conversation about assessment, and then they'll say, well, we'll wait and see what happens next year. And sometimes that's the best and right answer, but then you actually do need to look back at it that next year and not just wait and see another year and another year and another year forever. I also see some that will implement the change and then move on to the next thing without ever circling back to see whether that change had the impact that they were hoping that it would. And again, that's another important step, is that when you do implement a change, you want to see whether that's had the impact that you've hoped. So all of that is in the closing the loop sense. All right, so those are the 3 S's. In other settings. Now that this is always one of my own learning outcomes when I present about assessment, is I want people to believe that assessment can be fun. I think that assessment at its best, as I've got here, is about curiosity, creativity, and caring. And so I think it comes from the heart of teachers. We're curious to know whether our students are learning what we hoped they would learn, or we're curious to know what it is that they're taking away from our classes. We may have one thing in mind and they're walking away with something else, and that's fine, but I kind of want to know what that is and how they got from where I was to where they are. That's just part of the curiosity. That's part of the caring too, that all of us in theological education are doing it, or at least most folks that I know are doing it for a really particular reason. They might care really deeply about their discipline, or about their students, or about their institution, or about the communities that these students are going to be serving. And whatever that place of caring is, I think we all are wanting to do a good job and wanting our students to have the tools and supports that they're going to need to continue to move through their careers or their vocations. And so assessment at its best is those things. So taking together our interest in our students, our passion for our subjects, our caring for our institution, and our hopes and dreams for the worlds that our students will serve, and just wanting to know how what I do impacts what they can do, and then how I might do what I do better or more efficiently or more lightly or in a way that's more integrated or whatever that sort of thing is. So it comes out of a place of meaning. I also, because it's about curiosity and about learning, I think that assessment regularly can be fun because you get to try things on and get information and learn something and then try something else on again. So here are just a few things that I think can sometimes help. One is really to try to figure out how to energize faculty. One of the things for me that's sad about assessment is that many places have started to feel like assessment is a burdensome bureaucratic process. There aren't too many places I know when I go to people and say, I ask how they feel about assessment. There are always a few who are like, wahoo, I love assessment. But most people are not that way. And so to step back out of that and to step away from the bureaucratic, burdensome side and to talk instead about why we as a community do assessment, and maybe even talk a little bit about the theology of assessment. There are ways to talk about stewardship, or to talk about kind of the responsibility that we have as creators, or as mentors, or in other sorts of ways. So to come back to kind of that deeper sense. I think it's fair game to have conversation with faculty and the community more broadly about what they like and dislike about the school's assessment strategy. It's important to know what those things are. Sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do, but it's nice to be able to name that at least. And then when there are parts that really do excite people, to lean into that a little bit more. And then as you're looking at your faculty as a whole, and here I'm particularly speaking to deans or to assessment coordinators, to remember that different faculty members are going to have different levels of engagement or passion around this, and to try to lean into that again in different ways. So to know some of your faculty will be energized by numbers and some won't. Some will be more energized by stories and some won't. Some will really get into this kind of playful, curious side. Others would like it to be more kind of, I'm not that person, so I don't know what that is. But anyhow, to think about the personalities and the passions and the disciplines and all of that of your faculty, and to use those in different ways to advantage. I also think when assessment is useful to faculty or to instructors more broadly, that in and of itself becomes self-perpetuating in a good way. So think about how you can use assessment to really show that it can be effective and can make a difference for us. So to break down silos and to stimulate new ways of thinking. ATS's approach to assessment, looking at the degree program as a whole, encourages folks to talk across the curriculum and not just in their own little area. One of the strategies that I found really fun is to have faculty particularly who teach core faculty in a particular degree, to bring in all of their the assigned readings for that degree program, and then have conversation about what does the degree program as a whole look like with this. What's missing from these voices or these perspectives? What did you think someone else was covering that they're not? So to break down those silos. Think in other ways of how to have assessment really support the work of your school. Sometimes I'll hear from faculty that it feels like assessment takes them away from their work as teachers and as scholars. So how can you connect it more intrinsically so they see assessment not as contrary to their work, but as part of their work? And then finally, to think about how you can really make an event of it so that folks start to look forward to the assessment day or whatever strategy you might have. It might be incorporating worship into it. It might be incorporating some sort of celebration about the things that your students and alumni are achieving or engaging in the world. It might be making a party of it. Having food always seems to help. So not just as a prize, but to kind of recognize the ways in which you all as an institution are committed to your students and to the mission of the school in service of your larger communities.